The summer heat had a way of pressing down on the prairie, heavy and relentless, as if the land itself wanted to remind folks who truly held the power out here. Dust swirled through the wide main street of Cedar Hollow, catching in the wooden boards of storefronts and the creases of men's hats. Horses stamped at the hitching posts, their reins tugging against dry air that carried both grit and gossip. For this was a town where nothing stayed quiet for long, where every whisper seemed to roll across the plains like thunder before the storm. And that week, the storm came in the form of one man's wild decision, a decision folks would still be talking about long after the dust of that summer settled. The man was the richest rancher for miles. He owned cattle by the hundreds, land that stretched farther than the eye could follow, and barns built stout enough to weather any storm. His word was money, and his laughter loud, sharp carrying was almost as well known as his fortune. To the men, he was a figure too large to challenge. To the women, he was trouble wrapped in wealth, with a smile that promised everything yet gave little. He had always enjoyed being the center of talk, but what he did that July evening turned every head in town. He brought home a woman from the mountains. She wasn't from around here, not from the neat rows of houses or the ranches where Sunday church bells could be heard. She came down from the high ridges where the pines cut sharp against the sky, where cabins were built from rough-hewn logs and winters could freeze a man's bones straight through. Folks whispered about mountain people, how they lived cut off, how they carried old ways and stranger silences. And now one of them had been dragged almost like a prize into the center of Cedar Hollow, sitting tall on the wagon bench beside the rancher. The sight was enough to choke the laughter right out of the street. Heads turned, hands stilled, and every set of eyes followed them until the wagon disappeared behind the gates of the big ranch. The rancher, they said, meant it as a joke. He had been drinking heavy that afternoon at the saloon, his boots propped up while he boasted about how no woman could turn him down, not even some wild thing from the mountains. Men slapped their knees, glasses slammed on tables, and wagers were made. And sure enough, before sunset, he had returned true to his word, though not in the way anyone expected. Some swore he'd gone up the trail himself. Others claimed he had sent riders with coin and sharp tongues. However it happened, by the time the sun burned low and gold across the prairie, he had her sitting beside him, straight-backed and unspeaking, her face shaded by a kerchief tied under her chin. The townfolk gathered close in the days after, curious and cautious. They wanted to see this mountain woman who had been brought down like some trophy. The rancher paraded her with the pride of a gambler showing off a winning hand, always smirking, daring others to laugh with him at the spectacle. Yet those who caught a closer glimpse found their laughter stilled, for she was no timid creature. Her eyes clear, sharp, like the river. Water fed by melting snow met every stare without wavering. She didn't shrink from the whispers, didn't flinch at the smirks. If anything, her silence made the weight of her presence heavier. People began to wonder just who had been tricked her, or the man who thought himself clever. Children whispered about her in the schoolyard, saying she carried mountain secrets in her pockets, that she could call wolves with a soundless cry. Old-timers muttered that mountain folk were known to carry stories no one else dared to tell. The rancher only laughed at all of it, brushing aside the unease with another round of drinks, another loud word. "Just a bit of fun," he'd say, flashing his teeth. "Wait and see what she's good for." But there was something in the air, a tension that pricked like the edge of a knife, a feeling that this joke was bound to cut deeper than anyone guessed. It was during the Sunday gathering, when the town filled the wooden church with creaking benches and the sound of hymnals, that the murmur truly rose to a fever. The rancher strutted in with his mountain woman walking beside him. Her dress was plain, borrowed, but she carried herself with a dignity that made the silk-wrapped ladies bristle and adjust their gloves. Every eye turned, every throat tightened, every whisper tried to hush itself and failed. The preacher cleared his voice twice before he could begin. Folks tried to keep their eyes on the cross, but curiosity won over reverence, and before long the pews buzzed with speculation. What sort of woman was she? Why did she come here? And most of all, why was she still silent? It wasn't until the hymn had ended and the last notes of the organ drifted away that something happened. The mountain woman leaned close to the rancher. She whispered only once, a quiet string of words meant for his ear alone. But somehow, in the strange stillness that filled the church, the sound carried farther than it should have. Those nearest heard it plain. Others caught only fragments. But all felt it, the chill, the weight, the way the rancher's smirk faltered for the very first time. His hand, always so steady, twitched against the back of the pew. His face lost its shine of mockery, as though her words had stripped him bare before the town. No one knew exactly what she had said. Yet in an instant, the air inside that church turned heavy as a storm cloud. The rancher shifted, cleared his throat, forced a laugh that rang hollow against the silence. But it was too late. Something had passed between them, something that slipped beyond his control. The congregation left in a murmur of uneasy voices, glances darting, questions rising faster than answers. And by the time the doors closed behind the last worshiper, Cedar Hollow was no longer the same quiet town it had been the week before. For everyone knew, whatever she whispered, it had shaken the richest man in the county to his core. The days that followed only sharpened the curiosity. Folks leaned closer over fences, lingered longer at the general store, pieced together every scrap of rumor. Some claimed she had spoken of his fortune. Others whispered she knew something about his past, about the land he claimed was rightfully his. A few swore her words had nothing to do with him at all, but were instead a warning for the whole town. The truth remained locked behind her quiet gaze, her calm steps, her refusal to explain. And with each passing hour, the mystery only grew, until Cedar Hollow hummed with a single, restless thought. What had the mountain woman said, and why did it shake the rancher who feared nothing? The prairie stretched wide as ever, the cattle still lowed across the pastures, and the sun still fell hot and hard on the boards of the saloon porch. Yet beneath that everyday rhythm ran a pulse of unease, a sense that something larger was moving. Beneath the surface, the rancher still held his head high, but his laughter came thinner, sharper, as though to cover cracks forming beneath. The mountain woman still walked at his side, calm as a shadow that would not leave. And the town, for all its gossip, for all its guesswork, knew one thing for certain. Whatever had begun in that church, it was far from finished. Something was coming, and when it broke, Cedar Hollow would never forget the day the richest rancher brought home the mountain woman, as a joke that turned into something else entirely. The days after the church whisper spread across Cedar Hollow like wildfire. In a town where even the smallest rumor could grow wings, this one seemed to carry thunder. Folks leaned closer at the mercantile counter, voices low but sharp with curiosity. At the blacksmith's forge, where hammer met iron, the men spoke of little else. Even in the quiet of the schoolhouse, children passed folded scraps of paper, with guesses scrawled in pencil, daring each other to say aloud what they thought the mountain woman had revealed. No matter where a body went, her name was on their lips, though most didn't dare speak it loud enough for her to hear. The rancher tried his best to laugh it off. He was a man who had built his whole life on appearances, on being the loudest voice in any room, on making others bend under the weight of his fortune. He threw coin around the saloon more freely than before, buying rounds for men who nodded at him with forced smiles. He strutted through town as though nothing had changed. But those who watched closely saw it, the way his hand trembled just slightly when he poured his own glass, the way his eyes flickered toward the church whenever he passed. His jokes came, quicker, sharper, almost desperate to cover a silence that seemed to grow around him. The whisper had carved something out of him, and no matter how wide he spread his grin, folks sensed it. The mountain woman, on the other hand, carried herself as though she had always belonged, even though no one had seen her before that summer. She did not try to explain herself, nor did she rise to the curiosity of the townsfolk. She moved through Cedar Hollow with steady steps, her head neither bowed nor lifted too high. At the well, she drew water with the same calm rhythm as if she had done it her whole life. At the store, she waited her turn, eyes watchful, voice low and measured when she finally spoke. Her words were few, but every syllable carried weight, as though she understood more than she let on. It unsettled people, that quiet strength. Some women whispered that she was dangerous, that her silence was sharper than a knife. Others swore she was only biding her time, waiting for something no one else could see. Stories began to rise about her past. Some said she came from a family of trappers who had lived in the high ridges for generations, answering to no law but their own. Others claimed she was alone, that she had survived winters with nothing but a fire and the clothes on her back, living closer to the wolves than to people. There were those who swore she had been seen wandering the tree line in years past, her figure slipping between the pines, watching the valley below. The truth of it remained out of reach, and that only made the mystery grow. Cedar Hollow had never had much patience for secrets, yet here was a woman wrapped in them, and they couldn't look away. The preacher himself seemed shaken by that Sunday service. He had always been a steady man, one who measured his words carefully and guided the flock with a firm hand. Yet after that morning, folks noticed how his sermon seemed to falter. He paused more often, glanced toward the rancher with something almost like pity. He never spoke of what he might have heard, never clarified what the woman had whispered, but his silence only fed the unease. Some said he knew more than he was willing to tell. Others wondered if he too had been rattled by her words, left to wrestle with questions too large to lay before the congregation. As for the rancher, he began keeping closer watch over his property. Men riding the fence line said they saw him pacing at dusk, a lantern swinging in his hand as though he were searching for something in the dark. He had hired extra hands, strong young men who carried rifles as well as rope, though he told them it was only for coyote patrol. The bunkhouse buzzed with guesses, the cowboys whispering after supper about why the richest man in the county suddenly seemed afraid of shadows. They laughed to mask their unease, but the laughter carried no warmth. Each time the mountain woman walked past, conversation hushed, spoons stilled in bowls, and eyes followed her until she was gone. Children had their own way of seeing things, and they carried stories home that made parents shift uncomfortably in their chairs. One girl swore she had seen the mountain woman by the river, kneeling in the shallows, her hands dipped in water as if listening to it speak. A boy claimed she stood at the edge of the schoolyard one morning, watching the children play with a look so piercing he ran home crying. Parents hushed them, told them to stop inventing tales, but the unease lingered. Even the dogs seemed to sense something. They barked when she passed the yard, not with fury, but with confusion, as though they could not decide if she was friend or foe. As summer deepened, Cedar Hollow grew restless. The rancher's wealth had always made him untouchable, his word enough to silence most. But now, with his pride shaken and his power dimmed by a single whispered moment, cracks began to show. Some men who had once bowed their heads now lifted their chins when they spoke to him. Others kept their distance, no longer eager to be seen in his shadow. The rancher noticed. His laughter grew forced, his patience thin. He snapped at his foreman, barked at the hands, and once, when a merchant hesitated too long over his bill, He slammed his fist down hard enough to rattle the jars on the counter. Yet still, that unease clung to him, the kind that no money could shake free. Meanwhile, the mountain woman's presence grew heavier in ways no one could explain. She had spoken only once in that church, yet the power of her whisper hung over the town like smoke from a fire that refused to die. People leaned closer when she passed, searching her face for answers. They wanted her to speak again, to clear the mystery or deepen it. But she held her silence, giving nothing away. Each day she seemed to settle more firmly into Cedar Hollow, yet never softened into it. It was as though she had come not to belong but to stand as something separate, something the town would have to reckon with in time. The evenings grew longer, the air thick with the scent of cut hay and the hum of insects, but beneath that summer rhythm lay a tension that refused to ease. Some believed the rancher had finally met his match, though they did not say it aloud. Others feared the woman had brought with her some hidden truth, something that would unravel more than just his pride. And still, no one knew what had been said. It became less a question of words and more of weight. Whatever the whisper carried, it was strong enough to tilt the balance of a whole town. One night, when the moon hung low and pale over the prairie, a group of men gathered outside the saloon, voices lowered to near growls. They spoke of the rancher's hold slipping, of how the land he claimed might soon be in dispute, of how a stranger's presence could shift loyalties in ways no one expected. A bottle passed between them, heavy with drink and darker thoughts. Across the street, in the quiet shadow of the church, the mountain woman walked past, her steps even, her eyes steady. The men hushed at once, as though caught by something they did not dare name. She did not look their way, but each of them felt the weight of her passing, as if she carried knowledge that reached further than their schemes. By the end of that summer, Cedar Hollow was a town on edge. The laughter in the saloon sounded thinner, the smiles in church forced. At the market, neighbors exchanged glances that carried more questions than words. Children no longer dared whisper about the woman too loudly, as though afraid she might hear even from far off. And the rancher, once the strongest figure in the county, walked with a stiffness that betrayed his pride had been struck somewhere deep, where even wealth could not mend it. The whisper remained, hanging between them all, unsolved, untold. And, as the days rolled on, the people of Cedar Hollow came to realize that whatever truth the mountain woman carried, it was not something that could be ignored. It had already begun to change them, and the change was only just beginning. By the turn of August, the heat in Cedar Hollow was matched only by the tension hanging over it. The air grew heavy with dust and expectation, as though the land itself waited for something to break. Everyday life moved on. The cattle were driven to water, the wagons rattled down the rutted streets. Children ran barefoot in the dirt, but beneath it all, there was a quiet hum of unease. People carried the whisper like a hidden wound. They didn't know what exactly had been said in that church, but they knew it mattered, and they knew it had changed the richest man in the county. The rancher's temper was sharper than anyone had ever seen it. He barked orders at his cowhands until they grew stiff with resentment. He paced his porch at night, lantern lights swinging in restless arcs. Neighbors said they heard him shouting to no one, his words carried off by the dry wind. His pride, once unshakable, had been struck deep, and he tried to cover the crack with louder boasts and heavier laughter. But the townsfolk saw it for what it was. The man who had ruled Cedar Hollow by wealth and willpower now seemed like a bull caught in a pen too small for his own strength. The mountain woman stayed calm through it all. She neither defended herself nor explained what she had whispered. She did not play the part of a bride nor of a captive. She moved through the ranch with quiet steadiness, taking care of tasks without being asked. She fed the chickens, drew water, and mended with a needle as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Yet everything she did seemed to unsettle people more. Her silence wasn't weakness. It carried a weight that made others feel exposed in her presence, as though she saw through the surface of things. It was around that time that a new thread of gossip began weaving through town. Some said the mountain woman knew secrets about the rancher's land. Others whispered she had knowledge of old claims, of deeds signed in shadow and corners of the law. Cedar Hollow was built on land wrestled from those who came before, and the memory of those fights ran deep. The idea that she might hold proof of something unsettled many. Merchants began to look at the rancher differently, not with the same unquestioning deference. Men at the saloon lowered their voices when he walked in. Even the preacher seemed guarded, as though uncertain which side of the truth he now stood on. One subplot stirred in the bunkhouse. The ranch hands, men who lived under the rancher's thumb, grew restless. They were used to hard work, but not to the constant lash of his temper. They whispered among themselves at night, lying on rough cots under a roof that smelled of sweat and dust. Some said the woman was a curse, that ever since she came, the rancher had lost his grip. Others argued that she wasn't the problem that she was the only one brave enough to break the man's pride. A few even wondered if she might bring change that could loosen his hold over them. Their talk grew bolder, though none dared say it where the rancher could hear. Still, the seed of defiance had been planted. Another subplot grew quietly in the homes of Cedar Hollow's women. They gathered at the well and in church kitchens, their eyes following the mountain woman whenever she passed. Some despised her calm, seeing it as arrogance. Others admired it, though they would never admit it aloud. One young wife in particular, worn down by a husband's heavy hand, confessed to a neighbor that she wished she had the woman's strength. "She don't bow to no one," she whispered, glancing around before saying it. Such talk spread in softer tones, hidden behind chores and bread baking, but it was there. The mountain woman had unsettled not just the richest man, but the quiet order of the town itself. Then came the matter of the preacher. He had held back his thoughts since that fateful Sunday, but his hesitation only fueled speculation. Some believed he had heard the whisper clear and was burdened by the truth. Others thought he was shaken by the power of her words, unsure of what it meant for his flock. A few even accused him in hushed voices of hiding something, of choosing silence when he should have spoken. His sermons became disjointed, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. At times he seemed to look toward the woman with something close to fear, as though he believed she had seen straight through him too. The land itself began to play a role in the conflict. A late summer drought hit harder than expected, and water grew scarce. The rancher, with his deep wells and wide fields, had always been able to outlast his neighbors. But that year, whispers rose that the mountain woman knew something about the springs and the ridges, that she carried knowledge passed down from those who lived close to the land. Some swore she had told the rancher where to dig, though he dismissed it with a laugh when asked. Yet people noticed how he no longer mocked her openly, how his laughter carried a nervous edge when her name came up. It was as if he both feared and needed her. The children of Cedar Hollow continued to spin their own tales. One boy swore he saw her walking along the ridge at night, her figure outlined by moonlight, and that she spoke words he couldn't understand. A girl said she had heard the woman humming by the river, a low tune that made the hair on her arms stand up. Parents scolded the children for inventing stories, but when they lay in bed at night, some wondered if the youngsters were seeing truths the grown folk refused to face. Tensions came to a head one evening at the saloon. The rancher, drunker than usual, slammed his fist on the counter and shouted that no woman, mountain-born or not, would ever rule over him. His words carried through the room, sharp and cutting. A few men cheered, but most stayed quiet, their eyes sliding toward one another instead of him. The rancher noticed the silence, and it deepened the crack already running through him. He stormed out into the street, spurs striking sparks on the boards, his curses echoing down the dusty road. That night, the mountain woman was seen sitting alone on the porch of the big house. Her hands folded, her face unreadable. The subplots began to tangle together. The ranch hand's resentment, the women's quiet admiration, the preacher's unease, the town's shifting loyalties all seemed to circle around the same center. The mountain woman had spoken only once, yet her presence continued to stir the balance of Cedar Hollow. Every action she took, every step she made, seemed to press deeper into the town's hidden fractures. People could feel something building, something waiting. It was as though the whisper had been only the beginning, and the real storm was yet to come. By late August, even the weather seemed to mirror the unrest. Clouds built heavy on the horizon but refused to break, leaving the air thick and suffocating. Nights grew restless, filled with the sounds of distant coyotes and uneasy cattle. Folks lay awake in their beds, turning over questions they couldn't answer. What did the woman know? Why had she come here? And most of all, what would happen? When whatever she carried finally came to light, the conflict ran deeper than just a proud man and a quiet stranger. It reached into the bones of the town itself, stirring old fears and new desires. Some wanted her gone, believing she had cursed Cedar Hollow with her presence. Others wanted her to stay, hoping she might bring change they'd never dared dream of. And through it all, the rancher fought to keep his grip on a world that no longer seemed willing to obey him. He laughed louder, ordered harder, spent more, yet none of it erased the shadow of that whisper. Every eye in Cedar Hollow turned toward the mountain woman, waiting for her to speak again. But she held her silence, steady as stone, and in that silence, the whole town felt the weight of a truth they could not yet see. Something was coming, and when it arrived, Cedar Hollow would never return to the way it had been before. By September, Cedar Hollow had grown restless to the point of breaking. The heat still clung to the air, thick and unmoving, but it wasn't only the weather pressing down on the town. Every corner carried whispers. Every street felt charged as though lightning was waiting to strike. Folks tried to carry on as usual, but the weight of what lingered between the rancher and the mountain woman was too strong to ignore. People knew the storm was coming. They just didn't know what form it would take. The rancher's pride had soured into a kind of madness. His laughter in the saloon no longer drew smiles but nervous glances. His orders on the ranch carried not authority but desperation. He shouted at the men, punished small mistakes with harsh words and harsher fists, and fired 2 cowhands in a single week for no reason other than his own rising fury. Even those who once bowed eagerly to his wealth began to question how long he could keep control. The louder he tried to stamp his claim on the town, the more obvious it became that something had shifted. He was no longer feared the same way. His power still held weight, but it wavered, hanging by a thread. The mountain woman remained steady, and her steadiness unnerved people even more than his rage. She went about her days as if nothing had changed, carrying water, tending the garden, speaking little but always watching. Her silence seemed to grow louder the more the rancher shouted. There were nights when townsfolk swore they saw her walking the edge of the fields, her figure moving against the dark horizon like a sentinel. Children whispered that she spoke to the earth itself, that she placed her hands in the soil and listened for answers. Adults scolded them for their tailies, yet even the grown-ups couldn't shake the unease that followed her. The preacher grew thinner, his sermons scattered and weak. He looked older in just a few weeks, his eyes sunken as though he carried a weight he could not set down. People noticed how his voice faltered when the mountain woman entered the church, how he avoided the rancher's gaze altogether. It was said he prayed longer at night, staying in the church until the candles burned to stubs. Some wondered if he was begging for strength, or if he already knew something he dared not share. His silence spoke as loudly as hers, and together they left the congregation in quiet fear. As the drought dragged on, conflict rose over water. The creeks had shriveled into dusty beds, and wells across the valley ran low. The rancher still had water flowing, enough to keep his cattle alive, and this stirred anger among his neighbors. Rumors spread that the mountain woman had shown him where to dig, that without her guidance his land would be just as dry as theirs. Men gathered in hushed circles, questioning whether the rancher had stolen what belonged to them. Some said he had struck a secret bargain with her. Others believed she was only using him for some greater plan of her own. Either way, the balance of survival had shifted, and desperation is a hard thing to quiet. In the bunkhouse, the cowhands' talk grew darker. They were tired of being shouted at, tired of working under the weight of a man who had lost control of himself. Some of the younger men whispered of leaving altogether, but others wanted to stay long enough to see him fall. A few even dared to wonder if siding with the mountain woman might give them more power than siding with the rancher ever had. At night their voices rose above the creak of the wind, threading anger and uncertainty into something dangerous. They were men caught between loyalty and rebellion, waiting for the right spark to choose their side. The women of Cedar Hollow, too, began to stir. They gathered in kitchens and parlors, speaking low while the men sat outside with their pipes. They spoke of the mountain woman's quiet strength, of how she did not bow even when the rancher roared. Some envied her, others feared her, but all of them felt the change she brought. One woman said aloud what many had only thought, that maybe she wasn't there to tear the town apart, but to show it what it had been ignoring for too long. The room had fallen into silence after her words, the kind of silence that holds both hope and dread. The conflict began to bleed into everyday life. A shopkeeper refused to extend credit to one of the rancher's men, muttering that the rancher's name no longer meant what it once did. A boy threw a rock at the rancher's wagon as it passed, running before anyone could catch him. A fight broke out in the saloon between two men arguing over whether the mountain woman was a blessing or a curse. Chairs shattered, glass broke, and though the sheriff dragged them apart, the town felt the crack widening. Cedar Hollow was no longer standing on steady ground. Then came the night of the gathering. It was late September, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but refused to release it. Word spread quiet at first, then louder, that men were meeting in the back of the saloon to discuss what should be done. Some said they meant to confront the rancher. Others believed they wanted to drive the mountain woman out. No one knew for sure, but half the town seemed to have reason to show up. They came in shadows, faces set, voices low, the air thick with expectation. The rancher arrived already half drunk, his boots striking hard against the floorboards. He declared himself the only rightful voice in the valley, swore that no woman could undermine him, and promised to crush anyone who stood against him. His words spilled with rage, but they were met with silence more than cheers. The men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another instead of at him. The more he shouted, the more obvious it became that his grip was slipping. And then the door opened. The mountain woman stepped inside, her presence cutting through the noise like a blade. She said nothing, but the room fell silent as though every man there had lost his voice. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd, steady and unafraid. When they settled on the rancher, he faltered mid-sentence, his face paling even in the dim lantern light. He tried to speak again, but his words caught in his throat. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Some swore later that she raised her hand just slightly, though no one could agree on whether she meant it as a greeting or a warning. Others insisted she whispered again, though no one could say what they heard. What all agreed on was the way the rancher staggered back as though struck, his bravado crumbling in front of everyone. The men who had once followed him now looked away, ashamed or fearful. The power that had ruled Cedar Hollow for so long trembled. In that moment, and the town felt it. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, though the sky gave no rain. People lingered long after the gathering, standing in the streets in tight clusters, their voices low and urgent. Some were convinced the mountain woman had brought the storm itself with her. Others said the rancher had finally met the end of his reign. None knew what would happen next, but all could feel the air shift. Something was coming, closer and faster than anyone wanted to admit. That night, lanterns burned late across town. In the bunkhouse, the cowhands argued in hushed tones about whether to walk away or stay and fight. In kitchens, women whispered about what kind of future might follow if the rancher lost his grip entirely. At the church, the preacher knelt alone, his prayers carrying into the empty space, like a man begging for mercy before judgment. The mountain woman returned to the ranch house without a word. She sat on the porch beneath the weight of the dark sky, her face calm, her eyes steady. The rancher paced inside, his footsteps heavy, his curses muffled by walls. Every few minutes he passed the window, glancing out as though afraid she might vanish or strike. His shadow moved like a trapped animal, cornered and desperate. The whole valley seemed to hold its breath. The conflicts had tangled together into one not land, pride, water, power, silence. Every man, woman, and child in Cedar Hollow felt that the next moment would decide everything. Yet no one knew whose hand would pull the thread or what would unravel when it finally came loose. Storm that had hung over Cedar Hollow finally broke, not with thunder and rain, but with words. For weeks the town had lived in suspense, waiting for the weight of silence to give way. When it did, it came with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for turning back. The mountain woman stood on the porch of the big house, facing the town that had judged her, feared her, and whispered about her since the day she arrived. The rancher paced behind her, restless and cornered, but it was she who carried the moment. People gathered in the dusty street, their faces lifted toward her, waiting for what they had long feared and longed to hear. She finally spoke, her voice steady and low, but strong enough to reach every ear. She told them she had come from the ridges above the valley, from a family that had lived on the land before fences and deeds carved it into pieces. Her people had known the springs, the grazing paths, the shelter of the hills. When the rancher's wealth had spread like wildfire, swallowing acre after acre, he had pushed out not only neighbors but kin. The land beneath his boots was not only bought with coin but taken through fear and pride. She had watched from the mountain as he built his empire, and she had waited until the day came when his pride would stumble under its own weight. That day had come. The whisper in the church had been simple, she revealed. She had leaned close to the rancher and told him that his wealth was not his shield, but his shackle, and that the truth of what he had taken would not stay buried forever. It wasn't magic, nor was it a curse. It was a truth he had feared deep down and could no longer deny. He had lived long on power, but even power bends when the truth is spoken in the right place. The crowd shifted as her words sank in. Men who had worked under the rancher lowered their heads, not in shame for her but for themselves, for how long they had let one man's pride dictate their lives. Women stood taller, their eyes finding a new strength in her calm. Children who had heard so many stories now stared wide-eyed, realizing she was no spirit or legend but flesh and bone, holding nothing but honesty and resolve. The rancher's face twisted with anger and fear. He tried to speak, tried to deny her claims, but the words faltered. His men did not echo him this time. No one rushed to his defense. The preacher stepped forward then, his voice unsteady but clear, admitting that he had heard the whisper that day and had known it was the truth. He confessed that his silence had been born of fear, but he could not carry it any longer. The rancher's empire was not built on strength alone, but on shadows and silence. And both were now broken. From that night on, the rancher's hold over Cedar Hollow was finished. He did not lose his land in a single day, but the power that had bound people to him was gone. Neighbors who had once bowed began to stand straight. His men drifted away one by one, finding work on smaller spreads or striking out on their own. Merchants stopped extending him credit. Even his laughter, once so loud it filled the saloon, faded into nothing more than a bitter mutter. Wealth remained in his pockets, but it no longer gave him command. Without fear, he was only a man, and a lonely one at that. The mountain woman did not claim his place. She had never come to replace him or to wear the crown of the valley. Instead, she returned to the work she had always known, living with steadiness, with truth, with the kind of strength that did not shout but endured. She stayed in Cedar Hollow, not as a bride forced by a joke, but as herself, choosing her place rather than being chosen. She tended the land, and in time, others came to her not with suspicion but with respect. The cowhands who had once muttered in the bunkhouse scattered, but some returned to help her work. They said she treated them as men, not tools, and they found pride in the labor she offered. The women of the town found courage in her presence. They no longer whispered about her with fear, but with a quiet sense of change. Even the children, who had once spun tales of spirits and curses, came to see her as part of their world, a reminder that truth carries more weight than rumor. The preacher found his voice again. His sermons grew stronger, not with fire but with humility. He spoke of honesty, of courage, of facing the truths one fears. He admitted his own weakness, and in that admission, the town forgave him. He and the mountain woman often exchanged quiet nods in church, not as preacher and congregant, but as two people who had carried heavy truths in silence and found the strength to share them. The land itself seemed to change with the people. When the rains finally came, they fell heavy and steady, soaking the dry earth until it breathed again. The fields turned green, the creeks filled, and life returned to the valley. People whispered that the storm had waited until the truth was spoken, as though even the sky had held its breath. Whether it was chance or fate, Cedar Hollow believed it, and the rain washed away more than dust. It washed away fear. In the end, the rancher lived on his land, but smaller than he had ever been. He no longer commanded the town's respect, and his wealth did not shield him from loneliness. He had been brought low not by force, not by violence, but by a woman who had carried silence until the right moment to speak. That was the wound he could not heal. Pride had been his armor, and when it cracked, nothing remained beneath. The mountain woman's legacy was quieter but deeper. She taught Cedar Hollow that power built on fear cannot last, that silence has weight, and that the truth, when spoken at the right time, can change more than guns or gold ever could. People stopped calling her the mountain woman after a while. They called her by her name, learned slowly, with respect. She became not a mystery but a neighbor, not a curse but a reminder of what it meant to stand tall even when the world tried to bend you. Years later, folks still told the story. They spoke of the rich rancher who brought home a mountain woman as a joke, only to find himself undone by a whisper. They told it as a warning, as a lesson, and as a kind of legend. Children leaned close when the tale was told, eyes wide, eager for the moment of the whisper. And every time, the story ended with the same truth, that one whisper, honest and steady, can shake the whole world when it lands in the right place. Cedar Hollow never forgot that summer, nor the woman who carried silence like a shield. The town grew stronger, freer, and more honest. The rancher faded, but the lesson remained. And so the story ended not with thunder or fire, but with something stronger. The quiet Unshakable truth that no power lasts when it is built on pride alone.